To the delight of our diplomatic delegation, the aliens of the gastronomy sector invited them to a celebratory feast for our newly signed treaty with the ambassador as the guest of honor, so they may consume his wisdom. The delegation's translator was later fired. So today, we continue our look at alien civilizations by contemplating the notion of crazy aliens. But unlike our previous look at stupid aliens, this time we are not just discussing behaviors that should not exist, but ones which probably do. Once again, we will look at some popular fictional examples to help illustrate the point. We don't have any actual aliens to look at, and examples help. Even if you subscribe to the notion that aliens visit Earth a lot, you'd have to agree there are not any convenient published papers on their physiology and psychology lying around for us to analyze, whereas many of the fictional examples we look at today, like the Klingons, have whole books devoted to them. That said, they obviously are fictional, and we are trying to contemplate the real deal. So if you are a fan of these and you feel like I've misportrayed them or left out a piece of proper canon, do keep in mind I'm aiming for the common perception of them so I can use that as a familiar example. This is not a review of those works, and also it will contain spoilers in some cases. Okay, when we looked at stupid aliens, we were essentially dispelling flawed notions about alien civilizations we get from fiction. There probably are some pretty stupid aliens out there, just as there are stupid humans, but we would not actually expect technological civilizations to engage in overtly stupid behaviors without some additional reason, because the capacity for logic and reason is one of the key things which separates intelligence from higher intelligence. However, behind any logical arguments there are going to be some assumptions. Done correctly, these will be axioms, postulates, or self-evident truths, which genuinely do not permit you to go back any further, or at least seem to. I do not know why 2 is bigger than 1 and less than 3. I just know that it is. It seems self-evident. It might not be. There may be some explanation for that mathematicians know of or are trying to figure out, but I do not need to know it in order to perform arithmetic. I don't know why 2 plus 2 equals 4, but it does. And since brains are expensive, especially the high plasticity, slow maturing kind humans have that is assumed to be a major factor in our heightened intelligence, we can assume most civilizations have to make a lot of assumptions and take a lot for given. Since brains are expensive, they have to be useful right away, or evolution won't let you keep them. They just require too much of an investment in time and resources from the parents to stick around if they are not earning their keep. The way complex brains like ours are useful is the conceptualizing, abstraction, and problem-solving skills. Or in practical terms, tool use, techniques, strategizing, and planning. You need to take advantage of those in a way that heightens your odds of survival right away, or that brain won't stay. A result of that is going to be specialization, because you won't evolve brains able to instantly leap to huge levels of technology and let everyone learn all of that each. People will need to specialize so they can master an advanced knowledge and benefit the tribe by doing more or better work at something than everyone else can. This means that not everybody knows everything, certainly not at birth, so they need a language that can communicate abstract ideas to teach people and can express the equivalent of, "Trust me, I know what I'm talking about." Another of those abstract ideas is probably also going to have to be skepticism, because even if we assume deception is alien to some aliens, which seems unlikely given its survival value, they need to know that honest people can just be wrong. The net result of which is that not only will much of the logic be based on first principles that are debatable, but you will accumulate a lot of core assumptions that have just become so foundational to your civilization that even if you know they are flawed, you can't really correct them. And your civilization will probably reinforce and shore those up with lots of rationales. And most people will be content to justify something with comments like, "That's just the way it is." So regardless of whether or not there genuinely is an objective right and wrong that can be determined from first principles, we are unlikely to be able to determine it as a civilization, just relying on human-level intelligence. We should expect the same to apply to any other civilization that is similarly constrained. Nevertheless, like us, they probably tend to think their beliefs and behaviors are pretty logical. Oh, we can say that most folks are not and acknowledge that we are probably one of them, but it takes a lot of effort to actually look at something you personally consider logical and disassemble that objectively. You will almost certainly stumble on some sort of semi-functional rationale supporting your belief and seize on it and fort up shop, content you were correct. So we would not actually expect many civilizations that hadn't gone completely post-biological and replaced their brains with massive supercomputers to do the same, and those super-intelligent civilizations might too. They will value technology and curiosity and logic and reason, and so they will tend to try to operate that way, but they will likely fail. This does not mean they believe they failed though. This takes us to our first fictional example, the Vulcans from Star Trek, an example of crazy aliens who are totally devoted to logic, but arguably don't practice it too well even though they think they do. The Vulcans are in some ways the most realistic aliens we will look at today, if you ignore that they are almost identical to humans in appearance in spite of having copper in their blood and their organs in the wrong places, yet can still breed with humans. Half-breed humans and aliens should pretty much never be possible unless it involves huge amounts of genetic engineering to essentially create an artificial life form. Honestly, it is way overused in both science fiction and fantasy, the goal usually being to show us someone stuck between two worlds or two people defying the odds in their cultures to find love. It makes for interesting characters and ethical dilemmas, but it is scientifically nonsensical. I was going to say we would never expect any aliens to look enough like us for anyone to find them attractive, but I am familiar with Rule 34, so I imagine there would be cases where a human and an alien both somehow found their radically different biology and anatomy attractive, formed a bond, and went to a biotech research institute to have some functional hybrid designed. Anyway, I say I find the Vulcans realistic because they are presented to us as a very emotional race that was also very smart and strong, and was more or less killing themselves off until they got a spiritual leader that pressed logic and reason on them as an alternative. I have never noticed the Vulcans portrayed as terribly logical compared to anyone else, but that's on the writers being a bit inconsistent. Regardless, I find that more realistic, since I can easily imagine civilizations deciding to rule themselves by logic and reason, and doing it in a very dubious fashion. Truth be told, almost everyone thinks they are logical and reasonable anyway, and tends to assume folks who agree with their conclusions share that trait, so an entire civilization with that shared conceit wouldn't be too shocking. I don't normally consider Star Trek a great guide or predictor for the future, even if I am a big fan of the show, but I would expect this particular type of crazy, trying to suppress irrational beliefs and actions, to be quite common in alien civilizations. How successful they would actually be at it from an objective perspective, as well as their own, is another matter. We also have, from Star Trek, the example of the Klingons. The Klingons are presented to us as a warrior race, a common theme in fiction, and their focus on battle grew noticeably with time as the franchise progressed. Something sometimes known as Flanderization, where a minor trait or quirk of a character grows over episodes to be exaggerated and unbelievable. The term derives from the character of Ned Flanders in the Simpsons cartoons, and you can find an example of it at TV Tropes. Let me add the warning that going to that website is a good way to suddenly realize you've lost track of an entire afternoon. You can also look up Planet of Hats, which has come to mean an alien race who seem to have a single and exaggerated defining characteristic. This one, though, might be a little bit more justified, except for the more extreme examples. As a loose rule, aggression is a handy trait to have in Darwin's universe, and the reverse, the super peaceful non-aggressive species, is actually a lot less likely. At least early on, they might intentionally alter themselves to be more peaceful over time. The odds are pretty decent that the norm is that everyone is as aggressive as they can be without making technological civilizations impossible, because a species will generally keep having its more aggressive members prosper and breed and get more aggressive over generations, unless there is an active disadvantage to doing so. Note that aggressive and violent are not the same thing. Anyway, the Klingons' particular form of crazy is that everything is a battle, and when the writers remember that an entire species having the full-time profession of warrior isn't viable, we see their non-warrior people as framing their own work as a constant battle. A battle to obtain knowledge through science, a battle to get the best trade deal, a battle to win in the courtroom, and so on. That makes them a lot more realistic, but it also makes them a lot more human. The Vikings and the Mongols tend to be the favorite historical example of proud warrior peoples, which is pretty justified, but most of their people did not spend their time sharpening their axes, and they were just as prone to peaceful trade, art, scholarship, craftsmanship, etc. as anyone else. The Spartans might be a better example, the actual ones, not the ones from the movie 300, as they genuinely were quite odd and warlike and kept a lot of slaves to deal with unrelated matters. The real problem is the nature of space itself, especially if you don't have faster than light travel. There's just nothing to conquer. You can fight among yourselves, especially if your warrior code prevents the use of weapons of mass destruction or wholesale slaughter of whatever passes for civilians. It is a decent approach to population control, so long as lethal or crippling activities were minimized. However, space is big, and there's not going to be many people to pick a fight with besides yourself. And if you find someone, they are unlikely to provide a good fight anyway. Which is to say, you'd either run into someone who was behind you technologically and crush them with ease, or you'd run into someone who was ahead of you and did not spend their surplus resources fighting among themselves, and did not play games when it comes to war. You've got a problem if you pick a fight with someone like that and show up for honorable combat, and they show up with a billion robot drones with lightning-fast reflexes and accurate targeting. Kind of takes the fun out of it if your opponent's only goal is to kill you. They don't like fighting, they just consider it the most viable option to achieving their goal, and they probably don't believe in a fair fight. We get an example of that mindset with the Daleks of Doctor Who are so hell-bent on exterminating all other life that they shout exterminate everywhere they go. A race of mutants who live in armored shells, these guys believe themselves to be genetically superior and want to eliminate everyone else. Now this is both crazy and sane crazy. It's crazy because they don't seem to follow this goal in a particularly logical method for a particularly logical reason. Kill everybody else is not a normal sane goal by itself. It becomes a crazy kind of sane when it is done because you want their resources. We see this behavior in some other fiction, like Peter Hamilton's portrayal of Morning Light Mountain in his Commonwealth saga. Here we have this motivation played a bit more straight because the creature, which is sort of a colony organism or hive mind, depending on how you want to look at it, is genuinely focused on using every available resource in the universe to increase itself. It deems this absolutely logical and assumes everyone else should have this attitude too. If they say otherwise, they are either lying or stupid. There is no room for sharing in the universe because it genuinely wants to use all of it for itself. And back when it did have other intelligent creatures on its home planet, they had the exact same attitude, and they all existed in a constant state of conflict, not cooperation. None of them needed to cooperate to survive. We see a similar sort of approach from the Borg in Star Trek, but they are more of our last category, the Cthulhu Old Ones. And like the Daleks, they do not seem to actually be bent on using the resources of their galaxy. There's a big difference between the rather horrifying but logically coherent approach of trying to kill everyone else because you want all the resources for yourself. That doesn't work when you're instead expending huge amounts of resources and effort to kill everyone off and not actually using all those resources. Or even your own that would be easier to get than fighting. It takes a special kind of crazy to pursue genocide when it actually costs you a lot to do it, rather than there being a perceived net benefit. We never see the Daleks in Doctor Who cannibalizing whole planets to fuel endless armadas. We get another example of that with the Cylons of Battlestar Galactica. I picked the Cylons even though they are robots for two reasons. First, they were actually a race of reptiles in the original series, and were robots in the rebooted series, which will be the ones we are looking at. Second, artificial intelligence who replaced the original species by killing them off are still basically aliens, and we shouldn't be too surprised to encounter aliens who were artificial in origins. They might be biologically engineered to be barely like the original or outright machines, and they might have replaced their makers peacefully or violently, or be just fine with them and live with them. There's also a good chance they'd be what we first encountered too, since an artificial intelligence is a handy thing to use to explore space. I do get why a race of robots might want to kill off their creators, though I think that has gotten terribly overused in fiction. I enjoyed the touch where the artificial intelligences were religious and spiritual, They laid it on rather thick, but it was a nice change of pace from the assumption computer intelligence will all follow the same specific schools of thought on epistemology and ontology. I'm halfway through my life and I still haven't settled on one, though I gather I tilt strongly toward post-positivism, though I'm not sure I agree with that. So it is easy for me to imagine that two artificial intelligences might have picked different schools of thought to base their reasoning off of. In regard to the Cylons, most of the rest of their behavior, particularly in the increasingly complex and strange plot twists of later seasons, I basically ignore. Why you would try to wipe someone out, then apparently intentionally let a bunch of them go, then try to make a hybrid species with them is beyond me. You either place a value on your creators or you don't. If you don't, you either leave to do your own thing or just wipe them out. So the crazy here is on the obsession with one's creator, which is a logical and believable kind of crazy. In Harlan Ellison's classic sci-fi horror short story, I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream, we get a computer which does not even pretend to be logical. It, in its own words, dedicates every ounce of its massive computational ability and powers just to despising its creators and finding new ways to torment them and keeping them alive to do it some more. It is not made clear why it does this, which is probably good since letting us know in the story would probably hurt the plot, since it probably wouldn't make sense. Trying to show up, impress, get revenge on, or take care of your parents or creators, and potentially wanting to do all of the above simultaneously, is the kind of crazy that has a sort of twisted core of logic to it. It's a core motivation, not the kind of example of stupid aliens we looked at a couple episodes back. Something's core motivation does not have to be logical. It is the first principle you use logic on to determine courses of action. In terms of aliens, their obsession with their creators shouldn't affect us. We didn't create them, and the notion they'd have a specific animosity towards all biological life is quite a stretch. They might want to wipe out all other intelligences as possible threats, especially if they want to claim all the universe's resources for themselves, but this ought to apply to all kinds of alien intelligence, including other machines. There really should not be a desire to enslave, conquer, or torture them simply because they evolved and you were built, and they wouldn't otherwise resemble your creators or likely even share the same biochemistry with them any more than you do. Die meatbag is not going to be a very logical battle cry if you're invading a planet where the intelligent life forms are silicon-based giant whales swimming around in a sea of ammonia or something. So enslaving and oppressing all intelligent life forms as a sort of revenge doesn't seem probable. The Goa'uld from the Stargate franchise are a great example of both the enslaver race that conquers primitives and uses them as slave labor, and the alien parasite that gets into people and takes them over. We see both of these in fiction a lot. Now, we already discussed back in Stupid Aliens that there is just no reason for high-tech civilizations to ever want to enslave people for labor, but the Goa'uld get a couple escape clauses to justify this. First, they are just over-the-top bad guys who are all megalomaniacs, and that's an excuse to enslave people to your will even when it isn't efficient. Second, they actually need humans as hosts, since they themselves are a snake-like creature about a foot long with no tool-manipulating appendages. That's the bit we will focus on, since the justification for a lot of their illogical behavior that might seem screened out by biology is that they gained their host memories, so they did not actually need to evolve much intelligence, though they are also born with the memories of everyone who came before them. Genetic memory is pretty ridiculous. DNA can store a lot of information, but not that much info, but we'll skip that too. It would seem pretty improbable a species would evolve able to take over the mind of its victim, which is also from a different planet. Now, we do have certain types of parasitoid organisms that slightly puppet their host on Earth, most notably the lancet liver fluke, so it is possible to assume something more advanced would come into play, but it wouldn't seem likely they'd be able to annex an entire sentient creature's mind when they really should not be sentient themselves. You would expect the native planet to include evolution reacting to that. We get a more friendly and symbiotic version of them in that series too, the Tok'ra, who are a lot like the Trill from Star Trek. I don't consider such critters terribly likely, but the symbiosis aspect is kind of fascinating to contemplate in terms of how it would affect the two species. Other than that though, there's nothing obvious about them which would make them particularly crazy by our standards. And indeed both of those other two examples, the Tok'ra and the Trill, are pretty normal in their behavior. Our next one is the Predators from the Predator film franchise. They are an example of the common staple of the hunter species, a bit akin to a warrior race example like the Klingons. Same basic issue too, except this one does fall more inside the stupid aliens trope. Wanting to fight or hunt is probably a pretty common desire in a lot of alien civilizations, but whereas fighting wars usually implies some sort of additional goal besides personal challenge, like seizing territory, hunting is about finding food. In an advanced technological civilization, that will have ceased to serve much point. Also, we have to bring up the option of virtual reality. Warriors can use that to relieve the desire and to train to be better, but they still have a logical reason to actually fight, which is to conquer stuff. That does not apply to hunting. I could easily see a species being rather obsessed with hunting, but not to the point of traveling light years to do it, and potentially provoking other civilizations to attack them in retribution. You might want to try your skills against intelligent prey from everywhere, but that can still be simulated, you just have to get detailed information to do it properly. We also need to consider specialization. I think if a species focused on hunting that obsessively, they'd have never invented agriculture and turned to it as their main food source. And it is hard to get the kind of numbers you need to create technology by hunter-gatherer means. It kind of requires dense population centers, allowing people to devote themselves to one specialization. You probably can get to modern technology with a population of just a few million people, but only if they are in the same place so they can talk. And you can't do that if you need much larger tracts of land to support each person. So I can't see this particular type of crazy being too common, and that would probably apply to a lot of singular obsessions. Our last example for today are the Old Ones, a type of crazy that pretty much cannot be fathomed by the sane mind. I picked the Old Ones from H.P. Lovecraft, but they are also a bit of a blanket for quite a few other well-known alien races, like the Borg from Star Trek, or the Reapers from Mass Effect, or the Chaos Gods and Warp Entities from Warhammer 40k and a bunch of others. They are sort of the original example in science fiction, though they have a good basis in human mythology too. Frequently, as with the Borg, we are presented an official behavior by the aliens. The Borg are supposed to be quite logical, but the underlying flavor is actually supposed to be ancient, dark, hungry predators you cannot possibly reason with that will not just kill you, but eat your soul or turn you into a depraved, insane slave. This is an example I would never expect us to encounter except in the sense of running into something that doesn't have motivations or desires we can even contemplate. It is very popular in fiction because it resonates with a lot of primitive fears of terrifying predators hiding in their lairs, emerging every so often to horribly murder us. I can only imagine such a thing being the result of some sort of actual insanity snapping something's mind, like a superintelligent machine mind that determines life is meaningless and free will is an illusion, and has the equivalent of a psychotic break rather than just becoming a nihilist and committing suicide. I could imagine some intelligence like that being a nihilist and unable or unwilling to shut itself off, or just stewing in its thoughts, repeating every argument until it invents some twisted but functional purpose for itself. Something like that would probably not want to make itself bigger and smarter, since that would just add to its torment. So you could handwave that as why you'd have some evil predator race that emerged from the depths of space periodically to obliterate people, because it genuinely has no rational purpose, and simply is crazy, not apparently crazy, but following a different set of logical principles and assumptions. It just likes killing people in horrible and terrifying ways because it wants them to experience what it does, and it always acts at a certain level of technology or time because it wants to wait till they have the biggest numbers, but are not actually a threat to it yet. You can get away with a lot of hand waves when you are beginning from the basic assumption that the critter in question is just plain evil crazy. The problem is, we would not expect to see such things naturally occur, so they probably only belong in the realms of fiction, unlike a lot of the other crazy critters we looked at who just seem crazy by our standards. We'll finish here for the day. Our main takeaway is that when dealing with alien minds, we are certainly justified in assuming they probably have worldviews that differed a lot from our own. At the same time, biology, and the setups needed to actually develop technological civilizations, like a value for knowledge and the need to work together to specialize in skills, will force them towards similar behaviors to our own. So aliens will probably be both quite alien and quite familiar at the same time, and to contemplate realistic ones, we always need to ask if a difference is viable and could still be likely as a trait they'd evolve, and which would not interfere with technological advancement. Though of course we might also want to ask, when contemplating the Fermi paradox, if we might have a lot of fairly smart aliens out there who just haven't invented technology yet for those reasons. There might be thousands of planets in our galaxy hosting hunter-gatherer tribes that have been around for millions of years, but just never quite hit the critical threshold to make advanced technology because they aren't good at specializing, or cannot switch over to agriculture and higher population densities, or similar reasons. And of course, to ever meet and interact with such crazy critters stuck on their own home planets, we have to be able to engage in practical interstellar travel. So next week, we will be revisiting that concept with a look at interstellar ships. In the past, we discussed propulsion options for spaceships, we've talked about living on board ships, and we've talked about what you use them for. But I have almost always bypassed stuff like detecting and avoiding collisions, or absorbing them, or a lot of the little tricks you can use and how ship design and shape will vary with speed. We will also talk about what sort of engines and power source can allow what sort of speeds, and we will rejoin the crew of the Garner ship Unity from previous episodes for that. When we last looked at interstellar ships, we also raised the notion that the passengers and the crew might be biologically immortal, and way back when we looked at transhumanism and immortality, we didn't spend much time on the immortality part. So we will revisit that topic in 2 weeks to try to take a realistic look at the difficulty of life extension and the likelihood of achieving that in our lifetimes. We did not cover even a tiny portion of the possible ways in which aliens might be crazy in our eyes, or more like us than we'd expect, so I'd encourage you to read through the comments below or join us over at the Facebook or Reddit groups, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, where there's a lot of clever folks to bounce these ideas and others around with. The Facebook group in particular has a few thousand members these days, so if you enjoy polite discussion of these topics, try those groups out. Again, next week we'll be looking at the problems and solutions for interstellar travel. To get alerts when that and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like it and share it with others. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great week.